And I only have that spare time because I do the best Ruby and Rails training classes in the world with Jeff at Jumpstart Lab. So if you guys like what I do with helping out with Rails, hiring us means that I have time to work on it. So keep that in the back of your brains. Okay, so Rails 4, yes. Let's talk about it. There are tons of stuff in Rails 4, and there's no way that I can possibly explain all 6,384 commits to you in the next half an hour. So I'm just going to skim over some of it. I took the screenshot yesterday, and there have been some merges since then, so we're over that number now. But as of yesterday, almost 2,000 files changed, 6,384 commits by 49 different authors. So a lot of people have put a lot of effort into making Rails 4 super awesome, and there's tons and tons and tons of cool stuff, which is one of the reasons why it's taking a while. But basically, I'm going to lay out for you some of the stuff that I'm really excited about, some of the big features that I'm not that excited about, and then talk a little bit about Rails in general, too. So it's going to be good. So the first thing, this is the thing I'm most excited about with Rails 4, is not mass extinction, but mass extraction. So almost everything, not almost everything, but a large number of things are getting pulled out of Rails core itself and turned into plugins. I did some of the initial work on the observer stuff, but page and action caching, rat cache integration, active record observers, the session store for active record stuff, mass assignment and ArrrrCamp accessible, and active resource are now all separate gems under the Rails repository. They'll still be included in Rails 4, so you won't need to necessarily worry about this transition. And all of these will be maintained by the Rails team until Rails 5, I believe. So there's sort of a long sunset period, but these are all things that we don't think are good for every single Rails app anymore, and so they're being pulled out so that if you don't use them, you don't have to worry about that code. And that way they can take on lives of their own, right? So like nobody in Rails core is using active resource anymore, and hasn't for a long time. So it sort of stagnates because it's part of the bigger Rails project. So breaking out its own gem means that people that do use it can work on it and improve it, and it can get released at different times and all that kind of stuff. So I like stuff like this, right? It's like taking things out. I love commits that have negative stuff on them. And plus this gives people a way to work on a project that's not as big as Rails itself. So this is the first big thing. Related to this, so like mass assignments going away, didn't we just like fix all that stuff, in the first place, right? By turning on mass assignment by default? Well, basically, doing that kind of permission stuff in the model was sort of broken by default anyway. It really belongs in your controllers, because your controller is what manages like coordinating between your business objects, and permissions is part of your business system. So strong parameters is a plugin that has been integrated into core itself, and it will be the default way of doing model security standard. So basically what happens is if you do just person.create params person, like this would have used to mass assign stuff, like the first comment says, this now throws active model forbidden attributes exception. But if you do the second private part, I didn't want to break this up into two slides so the comments sort of don't make sense. It's like the first part and then if you add the second part. But if you add this person params, you can use this little DSL that lets you say that on the person we want to permit name and age to be assigned to. So now this will only let those attributes be assigned. If you try to assign other stuff, you'll get that exception. So now this logic can be in your controllers instead of in your models. And this has some other interesting sort of subtle benefits too. People start talking like validations and stuff. You can like not worry about all the security stuff when you're testing your models, for example, because they're in your controllers. I personally wonder, I haven't actually played around with strong parameters that much myself, but it makes me wonder if I'll actually start writing controller tests now, because the controllers will actually be doing some sort of work, which is an interesting thought. So I don't really know. But I do think this is a better place to put them than in the models, so strong parameters in core. Next thing I'm super, super pumped about is Rails queuing. So basically, this is a unified interface for job queues. So if you have any object that responds to a run method, you can do rails.queue.push and push that job onto the queue, and now it executes in a background job. By default, Rails comes with one that's based on Ruby's Queue class and just does, when you start up your Rails app, it spins off a worker thread that goes through the queue. So you get a queue by default. Of course, that's not production ready, and so Rescue, the next release of Rescue, and Sidekick both will support this queuing interface, and other queues can as well. So that way you, as a user, can swap out your queue backend and not necessarily worry as much about the actual interface. This is also nice because it's sort of the same thing as the cache, right? Like Rails.cache, and then store something as a cache. You don't care if it's Redis or memcached or whatever. This lets you substitute backends. I get excited about features like this because it gives us a way to talk about how we use these kinds of things in apps without referring to a particular implementation, right? This is like your classic adapter pattern. This is also really cool because it means that since we have a queue as like a first order thing in Rails, when you're running tests, for example, you can have this in-memory queue work, and if you're doing integration tests, you don't need to like spin up Redis to run your integration tests. You can just use the memory back queue, which is kind of cool. Another great awesome thing about Rails queuing is this means that we can now do asynchronous mailers. So now by default, this is how you make mailers mail in the background, aka you make a mailer. And by default, it sends the mail in the background, always. This gets configured by this class attribute. So if you look in Action Mailer base, now we have this queue attribute, and it's set to a synchronous queue at the moment. So it's not the same. Like this will not necessarily be out of process, but the point is you can set this queue to whatever thing you want, and then all of those mails will be sent in the background. This is like one of those features where every single Rails app adds it at some point, right? Like every Zawinski's law, right? Every web application ends up building email in, and it also seems like every single Rails app ends up having a job queue. So having this kind of thing be super easy is really nice. So I'm pumped about that. Aaron's been doing a lot of work on Action Controller Live. So if you use an awesome server like I think Thin supports this, and Puma, and WebBrick, oddly enough, then you can include Action Controller Live in your controllers, and this lets you do streaming responses. So 100 times write to the stream hello world and then close it, and this will essentially. You can do server-side events with this kind of thing, which is sort of like long polling but built into the browser, which is a little nicer than re-implementing it yourself. So this kind of sending stuff, chunked responses and all that stuff is neat. So we'll now have that as a first-class concept in Rails too. This has been kind of coming for a while. If you've seen any of Aaron's recent talks at RailsConf, he's been sort of explaining his work on this stuff, and it's neat. I don't know what I'll build with it yet, but I don't know. It's cool. Okay, so next up, these are some other features that are pretty big features in Rails, and I don't like to just say things are good because they exist, right? So these are all features that I'm personally kind of meh on, but you should know that they exist because they're big features, and you may decide that you like them for your apps. So don't listen to me when I say that they're kind of junk. The first one is routing concerns. So basically, if you are working on your routes, you can now, instead of this old style where you'd have so messages have comments and forwards have comments and uploads have comments, now you can say, I have a concern called commentable, and then include some routing stuff in that. And then when you're defining your routes, you can add this concerns key onto the end, and then it will sort of include that like a macro. So these two things are equivalent, basically, and it lets you dry up your routes a little bit. You're not saying resources comments over and over and over again. Yeah, I think that this is a kind of an okay feature, but I don't know if I would ever want to actually use it. I don't sort of like the macro pattern in general. But we'll talk about that in a minute. This is not actually technically in Rails yet, but because it's sort of just like making a directory. But basically, there's also going to be an app models concerns directory for active support concern, which will become the new default Rails core approved way of splitting up your big fat models into bunches of tinier things, is by making models and including like 15 modules instead of having one 300-line class. I am very concerned about this increase in the usage of concerns in Rails apps. So I found some concerning ridiculous images about it. I think this is a decent strategy. So like ultimately, it's better than nothing. So I would rather have a class that has 15 modules and nothing else in it than one class with 1,500 lines of code. But I don't think that you should fool yourself into thinking that it's better factored. Like after that code executes, you still have an object that has a zillion methods, and you still don't know where any of them live. If you look at, I was doing some work on Draper the other day, which wraps active record models. If you're not familiar with that project, and if you did the ancestor chain, it had like 30, I have a gist somewhere if you look at my gists, but it's something like 17 things are in the ancestor chain of a Draper object, including 2 anonymous modules that are just like in there. Because this is the way that Rails code is written in many ways. So anyway, this is going to exist, and I think that it's good that it's there, but I don't want to use it ever. Like, it's a transitionary tactic as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so then we're going to talk about the famed Russian doll caching, which is more formally called cache digests. This is where I have to make a really sort of semi-embarrassing confession, which is that I don't really write JavaScript basically ever. I do sometimes, but not that much. It's something that I need to personally work on. And so this this feature came out of the need to write less JavaScript. And so I'm sort of really torn because I like traditional web applications that don't use a lot of JavaScript. But when you start building things that get this complicated, I wonder if using JavaScript wouldn't just be easier, even if I don't like JavaScript. So I'm very conflicted, and I'm also a JavaScript noob. That's what I have to say. But basically, this cache digest feature, also known as Russian doll caching, basically lets you put these kinds of things into your Rails app. So this block, whatever goes in this block, will have a cache key that's associated with that particular object. So this might be on a part of a page. We're going to display the project's name and title, right? And so what happens is Rails will cache this HTML and put it in your Rails.cache and set it with a really super far expiration date. And it will also be keyed onto the last modified date of that object and any associated objects. There's a ton of options that you can really get into fine-tuning the details. But this is sort of why it's called Russian doll caching, is because if you imagine a project has comments, right? So you have this cache project block, and then inside of it you have cache's comment as well. So the overall cache would have this project stuff and then these comment stuffs inside of it. And so when you would break the comment cache, it would break the project cache, which would break your page cache, and then it would all get recached, right? Which, again, I'm sort of torn about this thing. I think that it's better than doing cache stuff by hand. So I like the fact that it automatically just works based on the last modified time of an object, right? Because there's 2 hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off by 1 errors, right? So I don't want to do cache invalidation, so this just kind of magically handles it. So I think that's pretty neat. But I want to use it in our project and see if that complexity of what all those caches are and what they're named matters. One other kind of cool thing about this caching idea is that you basically cache everything forever, and something like memcache will automatically evict the oldest keys anyway. So once your cache gets busted, you don't actually have to worry about explicitly removing the old stuff from the cache, because memcache will just handle that for you. That sounds like a way to use a lot of extra RAM on your memcache servers to me, but that's the way it's supposed to work, I guess. So cache digests. And it is also available as a separate gem if you want to not use it built into Rails 4, specifically if you want to use it on your older apps as well. All right, next up, something that if you follow me on Twitter, you've seen me talk a lot about lately, turbolinks. They're turbo. This is another, so again, this is a feature that I'm super conflicted about, actually. Basically, the way that turbolinks works is it's the same thing as PJAX, if you've ever used PJAX. So when I saw PJAX, I was like, this is an awesome idea, right? It's totally true. Basically, the idea of PJAX is that most of the time, sites have a layout that's pretty static and then a central content area that changes. So if we override new links to make an AJAX request to fetch just the internal area of the page, and then use JavaScript to replace that particular div with the new content, we request less stuff from the server, and we request both in volume because you're not refetching all your assets, and in that you're only fetching part of a page instead of the whole page, so it speeds up your app. And page push state meant that we would be able to do this in a way that's transparent, so that it wouldn't matter if you clicked on a link through AJAX or if you refreshed the page or clicked on it manually. So when a browser doesn't support this kind of behavior, you just fall back and it all just works nicely. I really like features that just you add them in and they just magically work and they fall back whenever you can't support them, right? That's a really cool way of doing things. So PJAX was cool, and we sort of had it on the Rails 4 to-do list, integrate PJAX for a long time. But then David had this sort of realization that actually most of the overhead doesn't come from replacing only part of the page. It has to come from loading all the associated assets and parsing the JavaScript and parsing the CSS. So it turns out that you can actually just fetch. TurboLinks does the same thing as PJAX does, but instead of fetching a particular div, it fetches the entire page and replaces the entire body with the contents of the body in that page. So I saw that and I was like, this sounds kind of ridiculous. I can't imagine if it's faster or not. So of course, we all went on Twitter that day and we're like, I can't believe that this is actually any faster. This must be bullshit. So after a full day of tons of people going well, no, I bet if it's parsing the JavaScript, that's probably only a little bit of the page load time. And CSS is it's pretty quick. And whenever I start seeing discussions like that, I get that XKCD, someone's wrong on the internet thing in my head, right? We pretend to be computer scientists. We like to talk about doing science, and that's awesome. But if you don't measure stuff with numbers, then you're probably not doing science. So hypothesizing on Twitter about the rendering speed of CSS in various browsers is not science, basically. So I took 20 minutes and I typed Rails new and I typed Rails generate controller page, and then I made a little Rails app that would let you essentially click a link infinitely. It would go page 1 links to page 2, which links to page 3, which leads to page 4, etc. And if you added a get parameter to turn off turbo links, or it would do it by default with no turbo links. And if you added a get parameter, it would turn turbo links on, and you would get turbo links instead of regular links. And then I wrote one little tiny test that used the benchmark in the Ruby standard library that Brian was showing earlier, and Selenium. And so it would load up the page in a browser, click links 1,000 times, and then close the browser, and then open it up with turbo links, click 1,000 times, and then close it, and then tell me the numbers at the end. And it turns out that in those tests, TurboLinks actually was significantly faster. Now, this is in my own hypothetical little Hello World Rails app, right? So David linked me the JavaScript for Basecamp and the CSS for Basecamp, and I also did tests with just the giant JavaScript file, just the giant CSS file, and then both of them together, and then also branches that have sleep in the controller to represent active model access time. But ultimately, my benchmarks are also bullshit because they're not real apps and they're not your app. So if you look at the benchmarks on my fake Rails app and then add this to your Rails app thinking that it will be faster, you could be wrong. So my overall point about all this stuff is that when we're talking about speed, you should actually benchmark what it is you're trying to improve and then make sure that that's actually improved, as opposed to thinking about it and coming up with an idea of whether it's an improvement or not. So ultimately, I think TurboLinks is kind of cool in some ways. In other ways, I'm not so sure. So it's the edge cases that I'm worried about. The big thing, the only thing that you really need to do, TurboLinks is 99% drop-in, is change your document.ready stuff to bind to this page change event instead, because doing the fetch will not actually cause the document ready to fire because you didn't ready a new page, right? You just grabbed some stuff via AJAX. So theoretically, this is the only change you need to make, and then all your links are super fast. And you can add this data no turbo link attribute to any link to not use turbo links in that particular link. So that said, there were 86 issues filed in the first 4 days of TurboLinks' existence. and a lot of patches got submitted. So obviously there are a lot of corner cases in this kind of thing, and so you should be aware that while it's sort of being heralded as a drop-in, it may not be a drop-in, right? You're changing the way your app works fundamentally. Your JavaScript is kept around a lot longer. This is probably a good thing, but the point is a big change. So I think that advertising it as a total drop-in is a little bit of a misnomer. It's like 98% just a drop-in, and it gives you maximum speed. The first thing I thought when I saw that name was like, Brondo, like TurboLinks. It's what Rails apps crave. So anyway, yeah. So I will probably use it on some of my projects, but yeah, it's neat, but it may or may not speed up your app. That's the point. Okay, so that's my sort of summary of features and stuff in Rails 4. But as you guys know, I like to also think a lot about like the future of things and analyze social situations and that kind of stuff. So there's some related stuff that I want to talk to you about involving all that stuff. The first one is understanding how Rails versioning works. So we don't do semver in Rails. We're sort of switching to this shifted-ish semver thing, but it's not totally exactly that way. But we changed a little bit about the versioning policy lately, and so you should know about this because we do get some messages about it on the bug tracker now. So how versions are going to work in the future. So Rails 4.0, first of all, is intended to be an easy upgrade. So ideally, it should not be nearly as bad as the 2x to 3.0 transition was. We're trying to keep everything as backwards compatible as possible. We will add a bunch of new features, but we'll also deprecate a bunch of stuff that we're going to remove, right? So if you remember 3.0 didn't remove some stuff, it deprecated a lot of things. And in 3.1, we removed them. So the same thing will happen here. 4.1.0 will remove all the stuff that was deprecated in 4.0. So you have a bunch of time to transition away from any deprecated stuff that you're using. But the big deal is that in point releases now, like the 4.0.x, we're not introducing any more deprecations in those versions. So like historically, Rails has sort of played slightly fast and loose. We sort of made vague promises about what would or would not be added in what version of Rails. And so we're trying to be a little bit better about making the point releases just bug fixes and security stuff and not adding features or deprecating old ones. And that, again, like we can't promise 100% on this, but like that is what is being strived for, is that new point releases will be as drop-in as possible. And sometimes it's going to get screwed up, right? So if you remember way back in the good old 2.3.7, 2.3.8, and 2.3.9, I think it was, there was like 4 versions of Rails in 3 days because you screwed stuff up. And that happened sort of recently with 3.1.16 and 3.1.17, I think. But like some stuff will occasionally happen, but we're going to try to be better about that than in the past. The other big thing that happens as far as the social stuff goes is like, when's it coming out, right? And I figured this is probably something that everyone was going to ask, right? I'm doing this talk on Rails 4, but Rails 4 isn't here yet. So the official line is when it's ready. That's when it's coming out. Now, David did say that he hopes that that means this year, but this is not a promise in any way, shape, or form. When it's ready, it'll be done. So that's the timetable we're talking about here, as far as when this will actually be good to go. So yeah. Okay, so that's enough about the stuff about Rails 4 specifically, but there's this other little thing that I want to spend my last 5 minutes on, and that's like the topic of this talk. So we were talking about, ArrrrCamp, like, hey, you should come speak at ArrrrCamp. And I was like, that sounds awesome. What should I talk about? And I was like, well, Rails is going to come out. Like, we should give this talk. And so somehow this talk came up as like the talk should be, why should I care about Rails 4? And I was thinking about this question when I was putting this talk together, right? Like, why should you care about Rails 4? And there's 2 things that bother me about the title of this talk. The first one is that it's sort of a subset of the question, like, why should I care about Rails, right? And And then furthermore, it's sort of weird that I have to be at a Ruby conference telling you why you should care about a new release of Rails, right? So that the fact that that seemed like a natural thing kind of bothered me slightly. And I was thinking about it, and one of the things that made me, that I've been thinking about with relation to this stuff is that, see, Rails is like the best web framework that 2005 has to offer. I'm pretty sure that someone else said this and not me, but I couldn't find an actual citation. So I don't want to say that I said it. I think someone else did. But the point is that Rails has changed a lot over the last couple years, and it's made lots of really great changes. But I think that someone who was working in Rails, at least maybe not in 2005, but like after the REST stuff hit, like in 1.2, someone that was working on Rails 1.2 and someone that was working on Rails 4.0 pre would probably find it a really friendly environment, right? It's still basically the same stuff. You got some generators, some scaffolds, some models, some views, some controllers, some ERB, some test unit, and it's like the same thing that it has been, and that's cool in a certain sense. And why is this? Well, one of the things is that, and we talk about this, and I think this is a positive thing, right? So Rails literally was born out of Basecamp, right? So the history, if any of you don't know this, so David went and built Basecamp as a Ruby web application and then extracted the useful stuff into this web framework. And I think that it's really important, right? So if you go to like some other programming communities, they implement a spec, like dudes in coats. Like if you talk to like an Oracle or the Java web stuff, like these guys like theorize, they write some dissertations on what a good web framework would be, right? And then they hand this giant stack of paper to some people to implement it. The architects hand it to the programmers, and they build the thing, and then you have to use whatever crap they imagined, right? So this is sort of pitched as one of the reasons why Rails is awesome. And I think it's legitimately one of the reasons why Rails is awesome. Like Rails has been solving problems since before Rails was born. It's built out of this real project. But this made me wonder, like, what happens if you're not building Basecamp, right? So like if Rails is a framework that's finally tuned to build Basecamp, what if you're not building Basecamp, right? And you want to build a web framework in Ruby. So I was doing some research into like what we know about Basecamp, because I don't work at 37 Signals, right? So I don't have any inside info. And this was in a blog post that they put out right after Basecamp Next was released. Another fun question to think about is, if Rails helps you build maintainable code, why did the premier Rails application need to be rewritten from scratch lately? You can come up with your own conclusions about that one. But, so like Basecamp Next, that JavaScript file that I was talking about that I used, it's a 45-line minified file, obviously, but it's almost 928 kilobytes, right, plus. It's like a fair amount of JavaScript. I think that David said is 10K lines uncompressed JavaScript. And if you look at the statistics for the actual lines of code, like it has 6,334 lines of code. Obviously, this is a couple months ago when it was first announced or whatever, but like this is a far cry from the like tens of thousands of lines of code projects that a lot of us have had now over the course of years. And so it's pretty small overall. And about this JavaScript thing, so one of the things that sort of bugs me is that like JavaScript is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the web in general. And as I said earlier, like I'm sort of a curmudgeon on this front. Like I like HTML and I like websites. I don't really like web apps as much. But like there's this 10,000 lines of JavaScript, and David says they don't do anything but a couple Selenium tests on it, right? And so this reminds me of like I fell in love with Rails because of the ability to test Ruby, right? So this is sort of like the PHP people are like, oh, unit tests are useful, but they're kind of hard, so we don't really do them, right? And with Rails, we said, like, no, unit tests are awesome, and we should be doing them. But we don't have a way built in of doing unit tests in JavaScript, right? Like, JavaScript is a second-class citizen in Rails apps. And so, and it's becoming more and more of a thing that people are using to build apps with. So I think that it's important that we sort of keep track of what people are doing with Rails and help them build it already. I think that Rails is a great backend for building JavaScript apps today, but there's more that we could do to make it awesome, right? Like I don't want it to be good, I want it to be the best. I don't want anyone to ever have to use Node for any reason other than that they want to use Node. But that's another side thing altogether. So there's a couple of gems that aren't in Rails core that I think should be, and you should treat them as though they're in Rails core. The first one is active model serializers, which is an awesome alternative to templating JavaScript. So you can give the serializer, you give your model to a serializer and it spits JavaScript out. The reason I take a picture of this Ruby Gems page is to note the download numbers. So this was in Rails, but it got pulled out because David said he wasn't sure if it was popular enough to warrant being in Rails. So 11,000 downloads and 9,000 for this version. Another great thing that suffered the exact same fate was Rails API, which gives you a thin controller stack and a bunch of other really useful stuff for building a Rails app that is just an API backend that serves JSON, like basically a Rails stack that's optimized for serving JSON instead of optimized for serving HTML. It has also 10,000 downloads. If we compare this to the things that are used to actually build Basecamp as opposed to other people's Rails apps, that routing concerns feature that I was met on earlier, it got 286 downloads before it was popular enough to include in Rails core. So the only way that we're going to be able to convince some of the people in Rails core that these are good things is to use them and to talk about them all the time. And one of the problems is that the things that are default in Rails are used by basically everyone, and other alternative projects often aren't. So sort of, I guess, my plea at this moment is to like try out active model serializers in Rails API and use them and blog about them and talk about them so that we can, like hopefully get them back into Rails, because I want to build not JavaScript websites that use Rails API stuff that's awesome, right? And again, I also don't think that Rails is bad for a backend for APIs right now. I just want it to be super badass. So because this is a presentation by me, I found this quote by Marx, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so this is sort of sums up the whole part of this like looking forward to the future thing. So what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this. The architect raises his structure and imagination before he erects it in reality. Besides the exertion of his bodily organs, the process demands that during the whole operation, the workman's will be steady in consonance with his purpose. This means close attention, right? So like bees are really productive, but architects dream for the future. And when you're building stuff for the future, sometimes you have to like think big about it, and that's sort of what separates us from people who are just bees working in cubicles every day. So ultimately, like, I am really excited about the future of Rails, and so I put this stuff at the end, but I didn't want to end on a down note. So like, I'm really excited for Rails 4 to come out and to use its features, but I think that we can do even better, and I would like your help in making it even better. And if anyone wants to start contributing to Rails and doesn't know how to help, since I recently went through that process, I would love to help you help us. So that's true too. I left the stock photo watermark on this image because I thought it was even better that way. I don't know what you guys think. I was like, I saw one, I was like, oh, it has the watermark. Wait, that's actually more awesome. So anyway, that's all I have for you. So yeah, that's why you should care about Rails 4. So thanks. I really hate public questions, but I guess if somebody wants to ask me a public question, they can. I feel like it wastes everyone else in the room's time. So like, I would love to talk to you if you want to talk to me individually, but like, if someone has something they really feel the whole class needs to know, like I'll answer one thing. But otherwise, I would just love to talk to you individually. Is that cool? Awesome. Thanks.